And I just get really mixed signals when it comes to Iran. I just hear that, okay, Trump does not want this war. We saw him stop the Houthi campaign because it wasn't going well. Surely that's a sign that he knows that we can't handle a war with Iran. But then I don't know if you saw this just yesterday, Witkoff came out and said something that made me feel like war with Iran is back on the table. I'm going to play the clip because I have it here real quick.
Okay.
We have one very, very clear red line, and that is enrichment. We cannot allow even 1% of an enrichment capability. We've delivered a proposal to the Iranians that we think addresses some of this without disrespecting them. And so that's important. We want to get to a solution here, and we think that we will be able to. But everything begins from our standpoint, John, with a deal that does not include enrichment. We cannot have that because enrichment enables weaponization, and we will not allow a bomb to get here.
So, what do you make of that?
Yeah.
No enrichment, that's a deal breaker for Iran, right?
No, they've made that clear again and again and again. And I'm confused because we are getting very mixed signals. That's one signal, that says, okay, those comments by Witkoff there tell you that, this is not going anywhere. The Americans are not serious about this. This was all phony from the beginning because everybody knew that the Iranians were not going to accept it. By the way, I noticed there was the banner at the bottom that said, Iran says that it will not give up its right to enrich uranium. And the right is in scare quotes. It shouldn't be in scare quotes. They do have a right, under the nuclear the non-proliferation treaty, to which they are a party. They are a signatory. And they do have that right. It's not something that they and so they're not going to give it up. They have no reason to give it up. To give it up is really a surrender of their sovereignty. And it's just like what Iran is all about in so many ways. Going back to the Islamic Revolution, the establishment of the Islamic Republic at the end of the 1970s, it is about sovereignty. It's just like we are not going to be a vassal of the West. And this would be, a real bending of the knee. They're not going to do it. And I think the Americans know they're not going to do it. So I don't know what Witkoff is saying. I've heard these comments from Witkoff and from others, which suggest, okay, this isn't going anywhere. The negotiations are just a sham. But then you hear other statements, both from the Iranians and from Trump himself, that suggest otherwise. So I have no idea what's going on. I really don't know what's happening.
So I feel like if you're making statements like this, then a deal isn't possible, and the only other alternative then is what? Is we have either we go to war with Iran, or we look really stupid for reneging on our very firm red line that we just put out there publicly to the world, saying no enrichment at all. Why would you say that so publicly? Go on news to say that when you know Iran can't accept it. Now it's out there. Okay, either you just completely fold and look like a complete idiot in these talks, or you're preparing for war, right? That's the only two things that I can think of that come out of this, right? Is there is there something I'm missing? What do you see?
Well, I think it's something that I've noticed. I hope that that I'm reading this right, but during the last couple of weeks, I think ever since the ending of the Houthi war, Trump has stopped talking about bombing Iran. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed something. But now he makes these threats. It'll be very bad for Iran. But he talks about economic sanctions. And in fact, they even have imposed new sanctions on them already. But he's talking about not a drop of oil is going to be exported from Iran because we're going to impose these secondary sanctions. And then we also had the news that the B-2 bombers were redeployed from Diego Garcia back to the continental United States. And that suggests, maybe this is all bogus. It's deliberate. It's it's just some sort of psyop or something that they're trying to create give the Iranians a false sense of security. But the messages that I'm seeing now seem to say, that indicate that, again, the military option's off the table, and that they want to use the economic sanctions instead to punish Iran. But the thing is, that's just so absurd. For example, if you're going to impose secondary sanctions to stop oil exports, who is the main buyer of Iranian oil?
China?
It is China, right? And you just back down. Are you going to impose 100% sanctions on them again? That doesn't work. You can't. So it just seems like they're a paper tiger in both regards, the military and the economic. In the end, what can the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. can do real damage to Iran. They can kill people. They can destroy some infrastructure inevitably. But that can't happen without serious damage being suffered by the U.S. And I think they know that. Oops, I'm sorry about that.
So anyways, you're saying that, these sanctions were a paper tiger economically and militarily. So why are we doing this then? Because if we place the secondary sanctions on it, clearly China is going to ignore it. They say, well, you're not going to do this to us. We can't. So
right.
what's
We've
the
been
U.S.
through that
going to
before.
do?
We know you're bluffing, right?
Right.
Or if you do that, okay, yeah, we've already shown that we're willing to, to accept your sanctions, but you're going to, it's the problem is on your side. Our economy, we can do without you. Yeah, we would rather trade with you. It's better for both of us. But we can do without you. You can't do without us. I think that's, the reality. And that the Americans began to realize that, and that's why they approached the Chinese and they rolled back, all but 10% of those tariffs that were imposed.
Do you think that there's some large collective coordination going on between the rest of the world, especially the BRICS countries with Pezeshkian and China, Xi Jinping and Putin and Lula, everybody realizes that, like, okay, the poor United States, they're a little crazy now. They still think they're in the top. Everybody sees the decline. We just have to humor them because he's kind of acting like a crazy guy with a gun. And we just got to be like, okay, you're doing good. We'll play around, humor you, but they're just kind of steering us slowly into the grave. Like, let them play these sanctions. We know that we're sticking together. We'll be fine. Both Russia and Iran have been sanctioned out the wazoo, so I don't think they care. And China has called the bluff on the tariffs. They know their strength vis-a-vis economically. The U.S. has been made even more apparent. So do you think that's what it is? It's almost like the world, they're acting like orderlies with the U.S. as the mental patient. It's like, okay.
Yeah, well, I think there's maybe some truth to that. I mean, I think, again, especially probably Putin really has so far dealt with Trump in a really masterful manner. I mean, that he's, he hasn't given anything, but he's shown a lot of respect. And, some of that is real. Like, hey, Trump is better than Biden. Trump has made some positive moves. Let's not forget about that. We are in a better position today than we were before January 20th. But we can also just see he didn't use this word in reference to Trump, but recently he called the European leaders idiots for their economic sanctions. And you could say by extension, if the Americans do the same thing, they're idiots too. And they have been idiots for what they've done already. And it doesn't work, especially stupid of the Europeans, because the Europeans are actually much more dependent on Russian resources, in particular energy, than the U.S. is. But yeah, sanctions always hurt both sides because economic relations are always about mutual benefit. So when you cut off an economic relation, you're hurting both sides. And sometimes you hurt one side more than the other. And it's clear that the European side's being hurt more. So anyway, that's the reason for Putin's rather unusually harsh language. He's generally very, very diplomatic, but I think he was just so exasperated. He just called them idiots. And he's got to be thinking the same thing about the Americans if they're really going to be trying sanctions again. But he knows that that it does not do him any good, to show Trump disrespect. You need to treat him carefully. You need to butter him up when you can, but without giving him any real concessions. At the same time, being honest. There's and he has been. It seems like it's not like I think he's given him any reason to believe that they're going to make these concessions. He has been firm. All the reports that we get from Witkoff and from the first conversation say that no, he didn't concede anything, but he does it in a way. Because if you remember when the ceasefire proposal was first made, and he turned it down, but he did it in such a diplomatic way that there were a lot of reports that seemed to suggest that he kind of accepted it because he was just so careful in his language. But if you look at it very carefully, no, he did not. He said, yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Great. In principle, we completely support it. And he said, but we need these conditions. And the conditions are actually very, very hard. And he hasn't backed away from that. And, again, that's been repeated again, even in the most recent negotiations. So, certainly when it comes to, the Russians have been, I think, have dealt with Trump in a very effective way. Now, there's always the danger that at some point Trump will just get frustrated and blame it on the Russians. It doesn't seem to be it's not the way he wants to go. I think he genuinely wants to get along, with the Russians. In that way, he's different from Biden. But again, we've talked about these forces, these people around him. At some point, it may be that they're not able to, I'm not going to call Trump a mental patient, but
they. Yeah, I'm not. But it's
I know you're talking about kind of like in general the whole Western. Yeah,
right.
I think
the deep state, the establishment, Russian hegemony is the mental patient.
Yeah. No, I think. So I only kind of tangentially answered your question there, but I think there is an awareness. It used to be like it was, I think Iran was the one that first saw it. But even within Iran, you had people that kept on pushing, what I've heard, even up to really quite recently, up to October 7th, you could say. There was still, like a powerful minority, a faction that was in favor, that kind of really believed in the West and said, it must be that it's because we have to make these concessions. It's just that we're the ones that are being unreasonable in some ways. And I think you've had that in Russia and in China too. And, but I think all three countries have learned that, no, the West they really are hostile to us, bent on hegemony, and they're kind of crazy, like you're saying. And, we need to proceed on that understanding. But again, these are all I think all three leaders, whether you're talking about Xi Jinping, Putin, or Pezeshkian, they're very rational. They're very careful. They're not going to do anything to unnecessarily provoke the Western side, but they're going to stick to their guns, and they're going to always be open to negotiations, but they're not going to allow these negotiations, to lead to concessions, which, they cannot make.
Right. The West has just been completely shattered on all fronts. The Western hegemony has. I mean, we think about it just in the past 3 years with the Ukraine war militarily and with the Houthis as well. We couldn't stop the Houthis. We've completely emptied our arsenals trying to stop Russia in Ukraine, and it hasn't worked out at all. So just militarily, we've just been very exposed, incredibly. I think the Houthis may have even exposed it even more so. Mm-hmm. Whereas we're seeing the other side, all of a sudden, Russia's weaponry and even the Houthis, and we've got a small demonstration of Chinese military technology. It's like, whoa, this stuff is really good. The U.S., not so much. So militarily, it's been shattered. And then economically, the sanctions haven't worked. We had this giant tariff war to start off the Trump administration. It's backfired magnificently. All of a sudden now Trump has to call Xi Jinping and says, okay, sorry about that. Let's work something out. It's just not working. These sanctions that we placed on Russia, now Russia is more powerful economically than before. They're growing at a faster clip than any other Western European country. And then morally, this is probably the most important one. Since October 7th, what Israel has been doing in Gaza has just completely laid bare any idea that somehow the Western world is the moral superpower. It's just completely gone now. All of this, and it's so clear to the rest of the world that the U.S. led order, Western hegemony, is over morally, economically, militarily. But it's happened so quick. I can't even think of a more damning combination that's happened these past 3 years without an outright military defeat of a country.
Mm-hmm.
You know that how quickly the floor has dropped out from Western hegemony,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's happened so quickly that many people, I think, in the Western world, they're just in disbelief. They're in a state of shock. And that helps kind of explain their behavior with European leaders, but also with Trump himself. With the United States, it's just this mantra for every politician: America number one, greatest military in the world, the land of the free. Everybody wants to move here, moral righteousness and prosperity. But that's gone. But they still are repeating that. And I think Trump, he believes in that still very much, and he wants to see America be respected and feared and admired. But it's not anymore because of what's happened the past 3 years. But I think some countries still understand that the mindset that someone like Trump is still in. And I think we saw that on display when he did his Middle East tour.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think Trump loved it so much, was that they showed him this respect. Like, let's, 100 camels, make it 1,000 camels. Trump will love that.
Mm-hmm.
Give him this plane, American flags, this huge procession. All of a sudden, now there's that old feeling that existed, 10, 20 years ago, of that respect, fear, and admiration for the U.S. But I think that when I was thinking about it, I think that maybe those Middle Eastern countries were just playing a game. They understood that now the U.S. doesn't deserve these things, but just for the sake of, like, using the mental patient analogy to prevent some type of fit on the global stage, let's humor him. Let's do this. And then, we can kind of gently lay this mental patient down for a permanent rest,
Yeah. Well, maybe that's somewhat overstated, but I think you're probably pretty close to the truth. I'd say, the U.S. is still a very prosperous country. It's the second largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity, right? PPP, and by far, actually, it still has a big military, and we've gone into all of this, but it's just it's just not okay. So it's not like it's nothing. It is an important player, but but you're right. The events of these last few years have, in an extraordinary manner, it's almost like it's been scripted from above. It's just like, okay, it's just like, we're going to have, we're going to kind of tear the veil, rip down the veil and let people see the truth here. And we'll do it through, these incidents, these events. And, I myself am amazed by what we've seen. If you had told me just 3 years ago that the U.S. Navy would not be able to defeat the Houthis, for example, I would say, okay, yeah, that's kind of I wouldn't even call that a dystopian science fiction novel. It almost sounds like bad comedy or something. But we've reached that place, that reality. It's just that, through, event after event, we are seeing that the United States is no longer is a long ways from being that hyperpower, that global hegemon. But it still has the pretenses, it still thinks of itself that way. It's still trying very hard to kind of maintain the pretense. And the rest of the world, I think, many governments were slow in seeing that. Again, it's just sort of like everybody got used to the U.S. being the top dog. There's always a lag between reality and perception. But I think perceptions are catching up with this reality that's been exposed to us all around the world. The one place where it's happening most slowly, where perceptions still haven't caught up with reality, is within the West itself. There's a real resistance to it. But I think there's a sense even within the West that, hey, things aren't right. When I'm sure Europeans look at the clowns that rule over them, and maybe they don't fully realize what's going on, but it's saying, this is, We are not the great power that we once were.
Right. I mean, you even said just like, the US is still a very wealthy, prosperous country. We have a large GDP. We're number two in terms of purchasing power parity.
Mhm.
But what we've learned is that's not really true, I think. With the idea, first of all, if we're wealthy, why do we have 36, $37 trillion worth of debt? Does that really mean we're a prosperous country if we have that much debt? And then this notion of GDP and PPP, I feel like these numbers are being exposed as just fugazi, just nothingness. I
Mhm.
mean, if we have a country like Russia with a GDP of what, 1.5 trillion against the United States, which is what, 24 trillion GDP, but
Right,
somehow Russia is able to outproduce all of NATO and
right, yeah,
the US plus Europe
right,
in a 4-to-1 ratio. It's like, so what were these numbers? They didn't
yeah,
mean anything. They were
right,
just, they tricked you. They made you think that you were more powerful than you are. But that's
right.
clearly not the whole story.
Yeah, they obviously measure something. I think again the PPP is a much better measure, and that gets you closer to the reality. But I think you're right. I mean, that another thing that it just strikes me that even in PPP terms, the West, vastly out is supposed to be, have a vastly greater economy than Russia does. When you combine Germany and the U.S. and France and all of them together, it's just I can't remember exactly off my top of my head what it was, but it's easily 6-to-1, 10-to-1, something like that. But as you point out, Russia's outproducing them, actually, all of them, including the United States, 4-to-1. You just, when it comes to artillery shells and other munitions, and you just say that, yeah, there's something that's just not right about these statistics. If they were close to true, this just wouldn't be happening. I think that maybe a big part of it is that they've been inflated by the service economy. There has been this over the last few decades, really. We've gone from being largely based on manufacturing to services. And yes, services don't make
You
real
know,
things.
right,
That's
right,
that's the problem. When you get into a war, I don't think your service economy really means very much.
right. Yeah, the Western economy, it consists of intangibles. People are just trading nothing, and that boosts the GDP numbers. But really, I think what you need to be looking at is the ability to produce tangible products, real things, because that type of manufacturing economic might directly will correlate into military might, especially in the need of a real mobilization in an event of a real war. I mean, that's what, if you studied World War II, the United States, that's what we did. We made a lot of things here, and then we just started churning out planes and tanks and ships at a rate that nobody else could do in the world. And that's really what helped turn the tide and made America so powerful. But now that we know where everything is produced, it's not produced in the United States. It's all produced primarily in Asia, China being the real manufacturing belt of the world. So, and I think China has a shipbuilding capacity, I heard, of 275 to 1 compared to the United States. So that, I think, is that type of metric is what we should be looking at in terms of comparative strengths with the country. Is get rid of all the noise in the service sector. Look at manufacturing, production capacity of a country.
Mhm.
Okay, you want to go to war with China? Well, for every one ship you build, they're going to build 275. You're not going to win that war,
Right. Yeah.
and you know that they will be able to scale up if they need to at a much faster rate.
Hey, but you forget, it's like the international center of shipping insurance is in London. We're talking about Lloyd's of London. So yeah, they lead us insurance. You make real money in insurance, but I think you can see, like, okay, you're depriving us of the insurance. We don't have to go back to the drawing board and try to build up an industry to replace that. We'll just find another insurance company, and maybe it
Right.
won't be quite as good. Maybe we'll find out it's actually better for the price. We were just sort of tricked by your reputation into,
Exactly.
going to you. I think that's actually something that's happened. It's like the
Right.
Russians discovered they had been fooled by, European brands. Oh, the European cheese, European everything has to be better. I'm sure in some cases it is, but a lot of times it really isn't. It's just, again, perceptions fail to catch up with reality. Their perceptions always lag. And
The,
this
you
was
know
sort of,
that That's very true. I think, those service type of industries, they can easily be replicated,
Yeah,
but people latch onto the brand name, the one that they think is safe and
right.
has a
You're
reputation.
right. It's just
Um,
like McDonald's pulled out of Russia, and now so the Russians just basically took it over, renamed it, and made changes, and nobody's complaining there. It's just every bit as good as McDonald's was. Which again, McDonald's is often better overseas than it is within the U.S. It really is a pretty good chain restaurant within Russia, but it's now called what Vkusnaya Tochka, and it's now run by Russians. They get all the profit, and nobody's really longing for the return to McDonald's. You say, yeah, what we have is just as good. We can replace these things, But that was all part of that, those economic statistics that made the West look so powerful. I guess what we're finding out is that a lot of that is illusory. It's just easily replaceable.
right. Yeah, the whole thing is just so insane. The whole house of cards is collapsing. At least for me, I'm seeing it collapse, and I think many people that listen to the show, because they follow this type of topic, they can see it as well. But most people in America, I think they still don't understand, don't realize it, and I feel like a crazy person when I meet somebody and they're like, "Hey, how's it going, man?" I'm like, "Oh, it's all falling apart," like